Thesis for today is Darren. Darren has been super hard worker. Right at the front of class, I think he's rewritten his whole thesis paper multiple times, right?
Multiple times, and they're all shorter each time.
Many different formats and versions of it, and the one he settled on has really worked out well. So these are Darren's words. He says, "I thank God for his grace and strength in helping me through this thesis. I also thank Mr. Wade, Miss Maymay, and Mr. Moon for their wisdom, and for my family for their patience and support." Darren's title is "The Story of My Life. Writing fiction helps The Story of My Life. Writing fiction helps children recover from trauma." Give me a second to get the timer set up, and I'll tell you when you can start. All right, you can start when ready.
This is what traumatized people do to their own bodies. They suffer in silence, these traumatized people, and they will not stop hurting themselves, not until their flesh bleeds red, not until their bones break, and maybe not even until they are dead. They hurt themselves constantly because they have been deceived by mental trauma into thinking they are worthy of nothing except pain and suffering. This is why mental trauma has become such a problem for young children, because it can persuade them to inflict physical trauma upon others as well as themselves. As of 2026, WHO reports that half of all children suffer from physical trauma in the form of domestic abuse. A few months later, the CDC reports that 2/3 of all children suffer from mental trauma before reaching adulthood. That is exactly the problem. We are adults. We create the world where children live. So the question we must ask ourselves is this: what can we do to help them? The answer may surprise you: fiction writing. But before I get into how fiction writing actually treats trauma in young children, allow me to define mental trauma. Mental trauma is a deep psychological wound, often caused by distressing events. Often, mental trauma manifests as erratic behavior, thus preventing anyone who suffers from it from continuing their life. Imagine how much more devastating mental trauma would be then for young children whose lives have barely begun. Luckily, the same young children can already access fiction writing. Fiction writing, as I define it, is simply the art of creating stories. Nothing more, nothing less. But for now, we'll look at the history of trauma, as well as mankind's understanding of trauma. In 1870, Professor John Martin Charcot's research on hysteria discovered that traumatic events can completely change someone's personality by altering their memories. As the times advanced to the 20th century, up-and-coming technology illuminated the stories of people who suffered mental illnesses, from depressed war veterans to washed-up celebrities to even psychotic, deranged serial killers. As it evolved, technology enlightened the modern public to the impact of trauma on mental health. Not everyone, however, was content to stay passive. Those with literary gifts, like the legendary late Jack Kirby, began creating characters, or as we know them today, heroes like Captain America, as a way for young readers to obtain comfort or relief in such a cruel, real world. The idea that fiction writing can become a provider of peace is certainly not a novel concept. There are already many writing workshops functioning mostly in African schools, operating on this principle alone. Aside from providing at-risk children with strong support systems, they also teach these traumatized children to control and master their emotions in a process that we call NET, or Narrative Exposure Therapy. For now, we'll look at how strong support systems support traumatized children. Traumatized children are often unstable, anxious, depressed, and withdrawn. Left alone, abandoned, they will act impulsively upon their own thoughts, hurting others or themselves. But children who grow up nourished by emotional support from their support systems are less likely to act upon these trauma-influenced thoughts. This is one of the ways fiction writing can help traumatized children. It can introduce support systems to these traumatized children or strengthen their pre-existing support systems. One support system strengthened by fiction writing is the family. Good families are the groups that contribute the most to a traumatized child's mental recovery. When a traumatized child struggles to find words that explain their pain, their story can paint a picture their family can decipher. A child, in other words, can use their story to communicate their emotions more clearly to their family. It can even be a fun bonding activity between both groups. Little Women, the famous book written by Louisa May Alcott, actually restored Louisa's family relationships. Following the publication and subsequent literary triumph of Little Women, Louisa's family bonded over the contents of the whole book, oftentimes discussing and identifying which of the weird sisters matched whose oddball personality the best. Another healthy community strengthened by fiction writing are friends. Friends teach children empathy and understanding. Through any discussion, children learn to listen to others and accept contrasting opinions. Healthy friendships consist of children who have mastered this skill, thus creating a social environment which reduces feelings of isolation while simultaneously reshaping the way that the traumatized child sees themselves. Arnold Lobel, an author and illustrator behind many classic children's storybooks like the Frog and Toad series, was once a lonely, sickly boy who could rarely attend school on account of his illness. However, he kept in touch with his friends through their stories. Lastly, fiction writing introduces an unconventional but ultimately healthy social group, the Creative Writing Workshop. In Nigeria, there are already many schools that have begun implementing the Creative Writing Workshop. This is significant for the recovery of traumatized children in those areas because the Creative Writing Workshop exposes young traumatized children to an audience of empathetic and attentive individuals who are eager to hear their stories, thus making traumatized children feel appreciated and acknowledged. All in all, traumatized children find the Creative Writing Workshop to be a solid foundation for a network of supportive confidants. Friends, families, and healthy communities are indeed very essential for a traumatized child's mental recovery. However, fiction writing also provides a more immediate solution, the dissolution of intense emotions. As we've discussed previously, trauma overwhelms the mind of a young child with strong, intense feelings which frustrates the child. They do not understand why they feel so upset all the time, and so they cope with this frustration by lashing out at others. Children are not yet equipped with a discipline gained by mature adults. They can, however, equip themselves with a pen and start writing, because fiction writing can help young children understand, express, and eventually purge overwhelming emotions. Most of the time, children lash out at others because they don't understand what's hurting them, especially if it's their own messy feelings. Nosrat Pareshkian, a Persian therapist, calls fiction writing an introspective mediator. In his words, authors create stories to inquire more about their internal struggles. Bolstering his claims are multiple studies from universities in places as far away as China and as close by as Solo, which demonstrates that students who do practice fiction writing actually have a higher EQ. During NET, remember, narrative exposure therapy, therapists can combine traditional storytelling with painting or puppetry to help the traumatized child gain insight as well as gain the vocabulary necessary to describe what they are feeling. Aside from providing insight, fiction writing can help traumatized children safely express their feelings. Children can transfer their feelings to the characters or places within their story. An example of this would be Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte, the author of Jane Eyre and one of the famous Bronte sisters. As a little girl, Charlotte Bronte suffered the loss of her mother. So, around this age, she created the entire fictional Kingdom of Angria, all on her own, as a place specifically designed by her for her to unleash her grief of losing her mother to the characters and places within her story. As she grew up, however, Charlotte learned to let go of the Kingdom of Angria because she depended on a reliable support system, her siblings, and afterwards she wrote Jane Eyre, healed from grief. Charlotte's story proves that traumatized children can safely express their feelings through fiction writing because their support system will ensure that they will not overindulge in the expression of negative emotions. Under the guidance of a support system, traumatized children can also purge their emotions through fiction writing in a process that we call catharsis. Catharsis is the release and extinguishment of emotions. We see catharsis in action in NET. A boy with an abusive stepfather may draw a storybook where a brave knight slays an evil dragon, and thus this abused boy experiences victory through the brave knight. Exploring and expressing emotions in a safe, structured environment nullifies the terrifying power. Catharsis, therefore, could be understood as the culmination of understanding and expressing emotions. It's what Shakespeare meant when he said that we should feel as wretches feel whenever we delight in his stories. Children according to George Herbert Mead, fully develop their personalities in what he calls the game stage. In his words, children play multiple roles in order to conform to each unique social group. Coolly before Mead posited what he called the looking glass self. Humans create a self-concept that decides their whole identity, including their emotional preferences. From their line of logic, we can understand that our personality is shaped by our socialization. Simultaneously, it is responsible for our emotion. Unfortunately, trauma attacks all three. Trauma changes the personality in three drastic ways, and these personality changes harm a traumatized child tremendously. In early 2026, researchers from the University of Mataram discovered that children who are exposed to traumatic events at an early age exhibit hypersensitivity to negative emotions, leading them to adopt people-pleasing behaviors. This is very dangerous because people-pleasing children crave validation and approval excessively, thus leaving them vulnerable to abuse or, in the worst-case scenario, dependent on their abusers. However, through fiction writing, these traumatized children are able to gain both the approval and validation they so earnestly desire because they can create characters with whom they would have a parasocial relationship. A parasocial relationship is a non-reciprocating bond in which one person invests emotional energy into an entity unaware of their existence, such as a fictional character. This illusion of intimacy actually helps traumatized children build deep interpersonal bonds, thus satisfying emotional needs like validation and approval without ever interacting with a real person. Now we move on to anxiety. Anxiety, by its most common definition, is irrational fear. Researchers from the National Institute of Health discover that children who suffer adverse childhood experiences, or to keep things simple, traumatic events, are very likely to develop anxiety disorders. Psychologists like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk explain that mental trauma traps young children in a state of perpetual distress. However, through fiction writing, these traumatized children are able to rewrite the traumatic events of their lives, thus reclaiming control, not only of their own life story, but also of their own anxious thoughts, rebuilding their personal agency and restoring their confidence. Anxiety, despite its frequency among traumatized children, seems relatively straightforward to treat, unlike the last symptom, low self-esteem. Over 60% of all children, or 2/3 of all children, as referenced earlier in the start of the essay, suffer from at least one instance of mental trauma before reaching adulthood. 25% of these children end up developing low self-esteem, as reported by the National Library of Medicine. Unfortunately, 90% of those particular children end up exhibiting that low self-esteem through suicidal tendencies, prominently manifesting in self-harm. Under the guidance of a therapist, however, these traumatized children can indulge in NET, narrative exposure therapy, and thus rewrite the traumatic events of their lives into a new narrative from which they could obtain a fresh new understanding and perspective on life. Instead of saying, "I'm a bad person and I deserve all the pain that happened to me," they will see themselves in a new light based on what they write and tell themselves this: "I am a survivor and I endured this." If fiction writing has such a profound effect on the mind of a child, is it not equally capable of harming as it is of healing? In other words, can fiction writing actually worsen the effects of trauma on a young child by becoming a place where dark thoughts are realized and sometimes vividly experienced to full, intense satisfaction? Not at all, because fiction writing also introduces and strengthens support systems for a traumatized child. Support systems for a traumatized child are much like brakes on a car. They prevent a traumatized child from immersing themselves too deeply or too fully within a story, especially if their story contains any harmful, negative content. Support systems, through creating and sharing stories together with a traumatized child, are able to raise them to accept the correct view about others as well as themselves. Lastly, we arrive at the most obvious issue. Why fiction writing? Simple. Because fiction writing enhances practices like therapy. One should never pit fiction writing against therapy, but rather enhance the effects of therapy using fiction writing. Because fiction writing can help young children gain the confidence to communicate their ideas to the therapist and slowly build a bond with said therapist in a way that both sides can comprehend. At the end of the story, fiction writing introduces or strengthens support systems for a traumatized child. It also helps them understand, express, and eventually purge overwhelming emotions. Lastly, fiction writing eliminates any harmful personality traits resulting from trauma. Now, most of us here are about to graduate really soon. And really soon, we will inherit a broken world, torn apart by war, ravaged by disease, with a dark, uncertain future. What we need most right now is faith, hope, and love. That's why stories like Lord of the Rings have become such timeless classics, because they're all about faith, hope, and love. Things that everybody needs, from children to elders, from people 1946 to 2046, and everyone, before, between, and beyond the present time. Faith, hope, and love keeps us sane and alive. The Bible records faith, hope, and love in the story of Jesus Christ, who arrived here on earth in a manger and departed a criminal on a cross for all of our sins. Jesus gave us his faith, his hope, and his love. But the greatest of these, just like what the Apostle Paul once said, is his love. For God loves the world in this way, that he sent his only Son, so whomever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life, free from the unbearable pain meant to punish us, free from the unbearable pain that he endured and his infinite love for us. Are we not meant to follow in his footsteps? By indulging in fiction writing, we are able to transform our pain into a story that will not only last lifetimes, but also soothes, comforts, and heals broken hearts across generations. That is the sacred duty of every author, from the beginning of time until the end of the age, to create a story from their pain, joy, hopes, and dreams that releases readers from their pain, but brings them joy, hopes, and dreams. Who knows? Maybe your story will bring joy to others. Maybe it will bring them out of dark times. Maybe your story will bring comfort into their broken hearts. Maybe your story will save lives. Maybe your story will save your life. You'll only know for sure once you pick up that pen. I hope that you do pick up that pen. Because in the end, I want to see all of you when we live forever together in heaven, happily ever after. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Good job, Darren. Our panelists today are Miss Denise and Miss Zoran and Mr. Zoran. We'll start. Sorry, Zoran. We'll start with Mr. Zoran first.
Okay. Hello, Darren.
Hi, sir.
You want to drink first?
Nah, I'm good.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, I appreciate the topic and the depth for which you put yourself into this abyss. Okay. Because I must say, I enjoy reading it, and I even found new facts from it. And I also appreciate the way that you confront trauma as it is, because I think it's a fact that trauma is the norm in this broken world.
Unfortunately,
in
yes.
this broken
Yeah.
cosmos, right? From Adam and Eve, we inherited trauma, right? I do have a couple of questions, and I hope that you can address it as candid as possible. Number one, it has to do with NET, okay? It's actually something new for me, so I took some time to research about it online, and I found this one, Net Institute. And when I read about the description, it's written there that it had to do mostly with factual chronological storytelling. It doesn't tell much about fiction writing. It tells that the person must kind of like sublimate his suffering into a writing. It's chronological, it's factual. It is something that is, I would say, real. And then you come up with this fiction writing. So can you like maybe help me reconcile this contradiction, perhaps?
All right, thank you for that question, sir. So I believe that the version of NET that you discovered online, that I think applies for NET to adults. However, NET for children, they are unable to confront their trauma directly, because if they do, then they'll get upset and distressed, as we discussed previously. So in order to avoid this, therapists will usually use fiction writing as a way for these traumatized children to sort of discuss their thoughts in an indirect way. An example of this is what the metaphor that I just give you. It's called, technically the variant of that is called visual storybooking. The therapist will ask the traumatized child to create a storybook, something they can draw, something physical and tangible, and they can just pour out all of their thoughts onto that book. At the end of the session, they will discuss it with the therapist. So essentially, there are many forms of NET that are applied for children specifically that uses fiction writing. Because fiction writing is the, well, we could just say it's the safest way to handle a traumatized child who are unable to discuss their feelings directly.
Okay, satisfying. And I must say as well, I mean, the character that you put here, the comic book characters, we're growing up with it.
Yeah.
And I just know that actually a fruit, some fruits from trauma, right?
Yes.
Captain America and many other things. So thank you for that. Now, my next question had to do with, I think you know what copium means, right? Copium.
I'm very familiar with that,
Yeah,
sir. Yes.
copium. So when someone's like trying to come up with negative things, they get like do stuff or like consume something to like
Yeah.
cope to suffering that,
Yeah.
right? And I kind of like, maybe this is like a worst case scenario, but what if the person is basically writing as a form of a copium? Like basically he is trying to overlay reality with his thick glass of fiction, which is not real. Wouldn't that be a deeper sense of escapism for you?
I understand your question, sir. So what you're basically trying to say, if I applied in the context of my thesis, is what if the traumatized child becomes so immersed in the story they just neglect reality, right? So actually, there is a solution for this, and it has something to do with the other parts of my thesis that are included in the actual essay. However, because of the audience here does not have access to my essay, I'll just elaborate anyways. So essentially, I've been discussing this entire thesis in the sense that children can use fiction writing to treat their own trauma. But what if we give that responsibility of treating trauma in a young child to someone who inherently has that responsibility? Parents. What if we do that to parents instead? So parents can indulge in fiction writing to help traumatized children. In this way, the traumatized child will not become too immersed in their stories because it's going to be a fun bonding activity between the parent and the child. Let me tell you the story, sir, of Rick Riordan. No doubt he's more familiar with the members of this audience because of his works, but Rick Riordan is the author of the Percy Jackson series, the very famous YA fantasy novel series. He wrote it once just to entertain his son, who was being bullied for his ADHD. So he created a story where demigods have this power through their ADHD to save the world. This is how you can use fiction writing to help traumatized children in a way that does not make them neglect reality. You use it as a bonding activity between a parent and a child. There are also many other examples, but for the sake of the question here, let's just stop at that.
Okay, thank you. It's fluent of you. Now, my next question had to do with the Bible. Okay.
All right?
So, I remember reading this book called Holy Resilience, which Holy Resilience,
Oh, okay.
which describes that Bible is a trauma-informed, inspired writing. Bible has many trauma, right? Old Testament, you see exile, suffering, fratricide,
Yes.
and New Testament, you see what Jesus been through.
Yeah.
That's another trauma, and the persecution. So we're all Christians here. We read the Bible. Why do you think understanding trauma in the Bible help us to maybe narrate our story of our life better? In your understanding, because I know you read the Bible. Thank you.
That's a really excellent question, sir, because it strikes at the heart of my thesis, which is how it could apply to us and our inner childs and to the actual children. Well, I would say, first of all, that yes, it's true. The Bible is a collection of people who suffered trauma and overcame that trauma to the grace of God. So therefore, by reading the Bible daily, we will gain the strength ourselves. We will realize and see just how much God has sacrificed for these, I would say, useless, worthless people that has failed him time and time again. Now, the thing about trauma is that it makes us feel isolated. It makes us feel powerless, lacking control. But the moment we open our Bible, we see that there's this divine being who loves us beyond his own life, who will do anything to return to us back to him. And I think that there's something empowering in that fact, that we can just open the Bible any day and skim through any story and discover just how much God has sacrificed for these people who don't believe in themselves. Case in point, Elijah. When he was being persecuted by Jezebel, I think, and Ahab, he went alone in the wilderness and he was basically depressed. He wanted to die. He asked God to kill him. What did God do instead? He just gave him food. He just told him to take care of himself. And I think that's God's way of telling us, whoever is going to read that verse, that chapter, that yes, trauma makes you feel like you're not worthy of anything. But lo and behold, I'm here. You're worthy because I died for you, because I chose you. So therefore, take care of yourself. And I think that is why when we understand more about our trauma, we understand inherently a much more about the love God has given us. Is that sufficient answer to your question, sir?
Very fluent, thank you. Now, my last question had to do with your audience, actually. You know, I know you since 3 years ago, right, 10th grade.
Yes.
You read a lot of books, copious amount of books. and
Professional nerd,
I
yeah.
appreciate that. But, you know, reading can be some sort of a strength, right, for some people. But not a lot of people like reading. And I noticed that over the years, we have a minority among the students. It's a sad fact, and we also know this country doesn't have a lot of like literacy level. But what did you tell to individuals who doesn't like to read? How do you like urge them to write? Because I think writing is another level higher than reading.
That's true.
So what do you want to say to maybe your audience, not just me? Thank you.
My message to the audience is just very simple. Write if you feel like it. That's the way that most famous authors discovered why they love to write. And how they became great authors in the first place. Simply because one day they were being overwhelmed by the troubles of their world and decided to escape into a fantasy world just for a little moment. And this is why they became great authors, because they are able to transform this fantasy world into a story that does not die with them. Stories don't die as easily as authors do. Therefore, when we create a story, we have this sort of obligation to take care of whoever's going to read it. That includes ourselves, most notably ourselves. So, by writing a story just for our own benefit, we are able to take care of ourselves. For all the reasons I mentioned before, we can dump all of our pain, all of our emotion into a story that does not harm anyone. We can use it to bond with our family. We can use it to get closer to them. We can even use it simply just to amend the bad parts of our personality. Stories are powerful in the sense that they encourage and enable whoever writes a story to simply be themselves in a way that no one would ever see, or if depending on that, someone would see. But the point is that writers have this responsibility to simply just heal themselves through writing. And by doing this, I think many of us here would have an easier life, or at the very least, an easier time of our life.
Okay, thank you. That's brilliantly answered. I'm going to pass on to Denise.
All
Thank
right,
you.
let's move to Miss Denise.
Darren, I really enjoyed this topic, and thank you for presenting it, and thank you for researching it. And I think as a fellow reader and someone who loves children and loves how important it is to share story with children, so I really identified with the topic. So I'm going to try to think of some things to challenge you.
All right.
The truth is,
Bring
I
it.
really agree a whole lot with everything you said. And I found it to be true in my own life with my own foster children as well. So, who experienced a lot of trauma. So let me just start with the question that really I was wondering the whole time you were presenting.
Of course.
You seem like you're pretty passionate about this topic.
Yes.
And I just wanted to know, especially based on the title, why is this topic so important to you, and have you found this to be particularly useful in your own life, and why?
So, Miss, to answer your question, I'll discuss about the title first. The story of my life is not exactly a reference to my actual life, but it's more of like an allusion to what NET does. You're basically, like what Mr. Zoran said, you can restore your life into a new narrative.
Okay.
But for why I chose the topic myself, you got it nailed on the head, Miss. Yes. I did choose it because it's something that's very close to me. And it's something that I've been doing since 6 years ago. Essentially just creating stories left and right. Whenever I feel down, whenever I feel happy, the first thing I do is write or read. And I feel like as if whenever I write and read, it just makes me feel better. There was this one time I remember that Kent, I'm not sure if he's in the audience here somewhere, but Kent approached me to help with his thesis. I think you know of this, sir. And even though I hated it at first because it was so annoying reading to automobiles, which I have no interest in, I eventually came to like it because there's something about the nature of writing, being honest to your feelings, just writing a sentence, telling a story that appeals to me naturally. So over time, I eventually liked it, and that's how Ken got his amazing thesis.
All right. I love that answer. That's fantastic. So I guess now if I need to try to push back a little bit on anything that you shared, I love that you mentioned that fiction writing needs to be combined with the narrative expository therapy. Is that right? And that you need kind of both to help a child who's undergone trauma. So I think
true.
that's really important, that you don't want to just leave them in isolation to write, but you want there to be this community and some kind of external wisdom or guidance kind of helping them process through. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So my question would be, why fiction? Because you mentioned at the end, we're all kind of longing and we're reflecting this grander story, which is God's story. And I think maybe that's a little bit what Zoran may have been trying to allude to. If the Bible itself is a true story, it's not a fictional story, but it's a true story of people who have experienced trauma and have overcome by the grace of God. Is there a need for us to really focus on fiction, or can we not just use God's word? And why would fiction be a benefit?
All right, so fiction writing can encourage the creative faculties of young children. They can indulge in it to be more creative, to be more literate, because to write a story, you need words, and you need to learn a lot of words. And so by indulging in fiction writing, they're able to train their mind to think in a way that is critical and to think in a way that is creative. And I think this is very useful because God designed us to be creative people. We are designed to have a mind that creates wonders and joys. And through fiction writing, we are able to discipline our mind so that instead of thinking bad thoughts, we're just going to turn them into fairy tales. Let me tell you the story, miss, of J.R.R. Tolkien. I think everyone here is familiar with him.
Yeah.
J.R.R. Tolkien, the giant of the fiction industry who created Lord of the Rings, was once a very lonely boy in the countryside. And he loved writing for the first time because his mother told him stories of old legends, of knights and Vikings and all that.
Right.
And eventually, though, after she passed away, Tolkien was overcome by grief. The first thing he did, I think similar to what I did, was start writing.
Yeah.
So he began writing, and after he came back from World War I, he also started writing, so that these dark thoughts do not overpower him, but instead he channels them into a force of good,
Yeah.
into a force of good that we can still see to this day, that we can still enjoy and read.
Yeah.
Because that is the miracle of writing. It preserves the greatness of God's goodness into a story that you can just enjoy. And indirectly, when you read this story, you reflect upon the goodness of God and realize, oh, I can see God in this character. I
Yeah.
can see the majesty of his kindness through Captain America, through
Right.
Frodo, through all of these characters who display selfless sacrifice
Yeah.
for our sake.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a very articulate answer. That's like a university level answer. So that was really well done.
Okay.
Really well done. And that's exactly why it's hard for me to find anything to disagree with. So
Bring it on, miss.
in your paper. So it's really, really good. So I think you kind of have addressed that. Really, I was going to ask, why do you think story is so powerful in healing from a biblical perspective? And you just answered that. So I think I'm going to ask one more. Do you think that it has to happen through the physical act of writing a story? Because I think in your thesis, you referenced, and in your presentation, you referenced that sometimes children are just verbally and orally relating the story. Is that correct? So does it always have to be like pencil and paper, or can it be an oral story that they're retelling?
All right. That brings me to another variant of any theme. It's called dramatic enactment. It sounds exactly as the name suggests. The therapist will bring toys, masks, or whatever, to help the traumatized child sort of act out a dialogue between themselves and the therapist. And essentially, yes, that's an example of fiction writing, because fiction writing, as I define it, is simply the art of creating a story.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be something that you write, but something that just brings you joy.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you added that and that you're including that into your topic. We had a foster son, Jeremiah. We have one, a foster son, Jeremiah. And when he came to, he was probably 17 years old, and he was very, very low functioning academic. So if you asked him to write a story, he would never do it. But in a therapy play session, just like that, he's getting toys in the sandbox, and he's creating the family. Like pick a character that would represent Wade, pick a character that represents Denise, pick a character that represents all the people, the birth parents and things, and then tell me about why you placed him here and why you placed him there. And that act of him processing through that was incredibly beautiful for me to watch and see him be able to verbalize things that he could not verbalize in any other way except through that venue, right? Through that mode. And so, yeah, I think that it's really powerful. And that was story, and I don't think he realized he was telling a story.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you included that in.
Yeah.
This is powerful. And so I guess my last question is, are you thinking about becoming a therapist, or are you wanting to be a writer, or what are your goals after this? Because I think you could go either direction.
Yeah, so actually, my sister does want to be a psychologist to help people. She's got a very compassionate soul like that, unlike me, who's more of an introvert.
Yeah.
But more or less, yes, I will be a writer. And writing this thesis actually made me discover like all of the joys of helping others through my writing.
Yeah.
Originally, I wrote just for my own needs, for my own purposes, because I was overcome with a bad day.
Sure.
And I just retreated into my room, started writing. But now I think of about all the people who are doing that, retreating into their own rooms, being surrounded by dark thoughts. And I think to myself, maybe I could help them the way that the stories of Tolkien, the stories of Lewis, the stories of the Bible helped me.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be my future after this.
Yeah, I love that you're taking that, something that perhaps starts as an internal processing that feels very personal, and recognizing that God wants to redeem that, and it's vertical and horizontal relationships
Yes.
can expand instead of it just becoming self-focused. So fantastic. Well
All right.
done.
Okay, Darren, I have a couple other questions for you. So
Bring it on, sir.
I'm inferring from your paper and from your speech that
Yes.
a lot of people have found, therapeutic sort of experiences through writing, even without involving a therapist or involving, a psychologist or someone like that. And I think you're saying, you can tell me if I'm wrong, I think you're saying that when you have bad days and you need, therapy, you can find some of that in fiction writing.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not such high trauma that we need a therapist involved.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's simply the art of writing something down or just telling a story that sort of alleviates most of the trauma, most of the pain that you feel during that day. An example of this would be, well, all right, let's just keep the question short.
Okay, good. And I think the other thing I was going to ask is that, I agree that writing is powerful like that. It's a way that someone can really, even if you're writing it not for others to see, but just for yourself, it's powerful. I think others might have just as powerful of a response with painting or music or poetry or dance
Yeah.
or something like that. Would you include those types of art also within this same topic in this same sort of a thesis?
So I think I've referenced this in my thesis, but for those of you who do not have access to my actual thesis paper, I'm just going to make my statement clear. The point of me doing fiction writing is because it's the topic that's closest to me. However, I do not in any way make it sound like it's better than other forms of therapeutic practices. Instead, I think ideally we should combine most of them. Because when we combine stuff like fiction writing with painting or puppetry, it helps the traumatized child communicate their thoughts more clearly. And because they communicate their thoughts more clearly, it becomes easier to understand them. Therefore, it's easier to help them.
All right, very good. One last question for me, and that is just the idea that sometimes, I think I've asked you this before, but I'm going to ask you again. Sometimes when you listen to the story of a psychopath or a serial killer, you see that in their past, they've written things about what they intend to do, and then it turns real. How do we ensure? And I think the answer is obvious, but I'm going to ask you anyway. How do we ensure that the psychopath is not, that we don't take our children who've had trauma and allow them to go down that path?
All right, so as I mentioned earlier, we can have the parents write the story for the child so that they can experience all of the reasons, all of the proofs that I mentioned before without ever succumbing to the immersion of fiction writing. However, there are a number of writing techniques that we could actually use to help discipline the child. So this is going to be a little bit of a creative writing class here, but essentially, there's something called the writing hat ritual. It's a bit occult, but essentially, what this technique does is that you associate your writing time with a physical object, like a hat. Dr. Seuss was the one who came up with this thing, and he had a famous collection of hats that he used for each specific character. For example, he wanted to write the Lorax, he would wear an orange hat, and once he put it off, it's done. We could apply the same discipline to children. For example, if they're really troubled, we could tell them, hey, wear a black hat or something, a black beanie or something, and then start writing. And if you take it off at any given moment to scratch your head or to just go to the shower, you're done. Your writing time is done. So yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, time is up. You did a great job, Darren. All right, very good. So here's the plan now. Family, friends, panelists will join Darren on stage for photographs.